Welcome back to Leviticus and our study in chapter 17 today. There is a PDF that contains all this information. You're going to see it up on the screen, but you can download it on our website. And there's a link down in the description, a bunch of other resources out there on the website as well. And the website's growing quite nicely and looking forward to growing that out over the years. Thanks to the Patreon supporters who help that stay alive and running. So anyway, Leviticus chapter 17. When did these events happen? We are in approximately the year 1490 BC. According to my calculations, the children of Israel left Egypt about a year before this in 1491 BC. They're now in the wilderness. God is giving them instructions for how he wants them to live as they progress forward as a nation. Our definitions section is kind of interesting for this chapter. The term that we're going to define, the only one, is goat demons. And not so much define it as just to give some clarity here. This chapter informs us that some of the Israelites had become accustomed to worshiping goat idols. There's actually a long history of pagan worship to deities that took the form of goats. We aren't told specifically, what idol this was that they were worshiping, but the Egyptians evidently revered goats. It's recorded by Herodotus, who is an ancient historian, and he records a particular reverence to goats in Egypt, so they may have picked this up in Egypt. Pagan worship of goat gods often included sexual practices because goats were viewed as symbols of virility and fertility. If you're familiar with the Greek and the Roman gods, you'll know of Pan and the satyrs of Greek mythology, and a lot of that may have stemmed from more ancient practices and more ancient pagan idolatry. So as we go over to page 2 and we take a look at our outline, verses 1 through 9, we have some laws regarding the place that sacrifices were supposed to take place. God spoke to Moses, and he told Moses to prohibit the Israelites from killing animals and sacrificing them somewhere other than the tabernacle where the priests were working. If a person killed an animal and sacrificed it and didn't take it to the tabernacle, he would incur, quote, blood guilt and would be, quote, cut off from among his people. God wanted worship to take place at his tabernacle and to be directed to him. The people were not permitted to worship with sacrifices elsewhere. The prohibition specifically, would have restricted idolatry and worship to demons and gods in other forms. And as we just mentioned, God specifically condemned worship to, quote, goat demons, as the English Standard Version translates it. Evidently, this is a practice that the Israelites had picked up on. The second section of the 16-verse chapter, 10 through 16, is a prohibition against eating blood. And this has been mentioned, I think, a couple times already in Leviticus and Exodus, mentioned here again, something they were supposed to take very seriously. If an Israelite or a person who lived amongst the Israelites intentionally ate blood, God would, quote, turn his face against that person and cut him off from his people. The reason that they weren't allowed to eat blood is mentioned here. It was because blood was the life source of an animal, and because it was used to make atonement for their souls in their sacrifices in the tabernacle. Any animal that was butchered was to have its blood drained, and then that blood was supposed to be covered in earth or covered in dirt. Then verse 14 says this, quote, for the life of every creature is its blood is its life. Therefore, I have said to the people of Israel, you shall not eat the blood of any creature, for the life of every creature is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. Leviticus 17:14. That is Leviticus chapter 17, a little bit shorter than the last couple chapters. Now let's finish off with our application. Let's take an application from that prohibition of offering sacrifices in other locations other than the tabernacle. God doesn't accept divided affections. He was not content to be worshipped as one God among the many gods. He was and he is the true God, the only God worthy of worship. And 3,500 years later places us in about 2023. Although we've changed in a lot of ways, God hasn't changed. While we may not be worshiping goat demons and offering animals as sacrifices in pagan temples, we do have the same bad habit of only giving God part of our attention and adoration. Many people have been convinced that they can worship God on their Sundays and they can worship other things the rest of the week, worshiping it by giving it their full heart, their full devotion, possessions, notoriety, education, hobbies, career, etc. Right? But God still requires complete devotion. Anything that competes with our devotion and our service to God is a competing idol, whether it takes the form of a goat or not.